is the Doing Diversity in Writing podcast, the show where we as authors explore the better practices of writing inclusively, whether that be in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, class, sexuality, ability, and so on. Why are we here? To bring more depth and breadth to the characters in our fiction and represent them in the best way possible. My name is Bethany A. Tucker, and with me each week is my co-host, Mariëlle S. Smith. Ready? Let's dive in. Hey everyone, this is season 2 of Doing Diversity in Writing, and I am with Mariëlle as I am every week, but today we are also interviewing with Clare Sager, and say hi everyone.
Hi.
Hello.
Let's just jump in and welcome Clare and tell everyone about her and get into the questions if you don't mind.
Yes, let's do that. Okay. So Clare Sager is an office lackey turned full-time author. With both a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Arts in Creative Writing, she is now living her lifelong dream of writing fantasy adventure stories of swoon-worthy, troublesome men and strong, sassy women who can handle them. When she's not writing or master planning her next book, she's an editor, outline coach, and formatter. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, sewing, and lifting weights at the gym. She's as shocked by the latter as anyone. Her stationery addiction knows no bounds, with a washi tape and fountain pen collection to rival that of a stationery store. She loves to spend time chilling out with her planner, plotting world domination. She likes cats, coffee, and cocktails, and speaks fluent sarcasm. Welcome, Clare.
Thank you so much. Hello.
Welcome. So glad that somebody else speaks fluent sarcasm.
I was about to say, I love that.
I learned the word today, sarcasm, as in the gap that exists when somebody doesn't get your sarcasm.
Yeah, that was going to be my guess as to its meaning. And yeah, I have encountered that a few times.
Say, people think I'm too serious, like they don't get it often.
Yeah, it can be like sometimes people say it in too deadpan a way. I find myself having to like pull really over the top facial expressions so people get that I'm joking.
Yes, and I often say, you really think I would be serious about that? You don't know me at all. Okay. So welcome to, what was it, episode 10?
I think it's going to be episode 10. I would have to check our calendar because we've had to reschedule this around life events. I think I had COVID when we were supposed to record this the first time.
Yes, and then your computer crashed.
It didn't just crash. It completely died and I had to ship it to Texas.
Oh my goodness.
But
that was a double whammy.
Clare, Mariëlle, you two actually know each other to some extent. But this is the first time Clare and I are talking. So how do you two know each other?
Well, this is also the first time Clare and I are talking, because we kind of were both at a conference in Edinburgh in 2019 before COVID. Before our life, before the pandemic, but we didn't actually meet. I think we just started hanging out online due to mutual friends.
Do you know what it was? You posted, it might have been in the group or else just on Facebook, about doing tarot readings. It was after I had left, and I was like, oh my God, it's like I'm into tarot. And so it's like I'd missed you, but we got talking because of that.
Yes, and then I remember, because also I am a big fan of Clare's work and I'm actually on her beta team. But the thing is that I remember from the conference, because I think Stuart Bach showed your cover during his talk, and I just fell in love with it so much. I know you're changing everything now, but I have opinions about that I'm not going to share because I love it. So I remember like buying your book. And then when the pandemic started, we had our first lockdown. That's when I read it. And then I just sort of read everything that you had.
And that's why you're on my beta team.
Yes. Yeah. So this is actually, this is the first time. So we have talked like on Facebook and stuff, but we've never actually talked in real life.
The actual voices.
Yeah. But it's fun how that goes in groups like this. Like you can just connect over something.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like so many people. I mean, I've got some people that are really close friends with that I talk to like every day, but I've never met them in person. Or haven't yet.
We're also 2 years into this pandemic, so virtual friends are a thing.
Yes.
I've hit the mainstream.
It's been 2 years today since the first infected person arrived from the UK in Cyprus. So they were like,
wow.
"Oh, it's been 2 years." I was like, "Don't
like,
write like that. Like it's a
yeah.
celebration. Like it's yeah." So Claire, I know why I wanted to have you on the show. Would you say that you write characters outside or perhaps beside your own identities and experiences in your work?
Yeah, so we kind of touched upon this a bit before we started recording, but I mean, obviously for people listening, I am a cis woman. I look pretty white, although I'm half British and half Turkish Cypriot. So like that half of my family have brown skin basically, and they are Muslim. I've also lived with anxiety all my life. So all of those things absolutely inform what I write, but obviously that's not the only thing I write. I do write fantasy, so no experiences are ever quite the same. You know, obviously the history of my fantasy world doesn't have the same background and same history and same tensions as the real world. I think one of the things I enjoy about fantasy is there's always that level of removal that then allows you to explore real world issues, but from a slightly different angle and in a slightly different way.
Is that why you set up your world the way it was? To do like a sort of a what if?
Yeah, exactly. So if you looked at a map of the world that I write in, which I call the Saberverse, after the saber cats in it, it basically looks like Earth on a map, but the history and everything, the way that's all played out is really different. For example, there are no monotheistic religions in that world. There was empire back in roughly sort of essentially the Roman era, but then there hasn't been empire since then. So a lot of the issues that I see as maybe coming from ideas of empire and certain ideas that certain monotheistic religions haven't played out in that world, if that makes any sense.
So what did you use to inform your world, and what issues do you have playing out?
I often pull out things that I have seen in real life, because as I said, this is, I think, for me, the beauty of fantasy, that you can, rather than saying to someone, I'm going to tell you a story that's about the Me Too movement, for example, and someone goes, oh, no, I don't. I just came for a bit of a fun story and an adventure and some romance. Like, I'm not interested in reading about something as heavy as that. Rather than having that, I can say, oh, I'm going to tell you a swashbuckling romance story with a little bit of serial killing and Me Too movement adjacent stuff going on. So, like Mariëlle, you've read the second Counterfeit Contessa book, and that basically really has a strong thread of essentially all the things behind the Me Too movement, like sexual assault and so on, run through that. So that was completely directly inspired by things as diverse as the Jack the Ripper killings in the late 19th century, as well as like my experiences, friends' experiences, things like that in the real world.
Yeah, that was a really brutal book to read.
It was pretty dark to write.
It was only imagine.
It was really good, but it was really I had moments that I was like, am I gonna read through this, or do I need a break? And not a break in terms of, oh, it's getting boring, but more, I'm afraid this is gonna get worse. So do I stop now, or do I go to the next page?
But because it's fantasy, it is easier to get through. It is easier to grapple with. We can go places. And also, like you said, you brought in something from Jack the Ripper, like, which is historical. I believe later 1800s UK. Yeah,
it was, I want to say 1888 off the top of my head.
That matches with what I was going to guess, but I'm not as up on UK history. And then something extremely modern. I mean, to me, that is the magic of fantasy, is just the flexibility of what you can deal with in not necessarily a safe space, but definitely a more creative and flexible space.
Yeah, it's kind of a step removed. So I think sometimes people don't bring the same biases in that they maybe would have in a story that is purporting to be in quote unquote the real world.
Yeah, I see that. Yeah, what I found really interesting is that it's not sat in a world, it's not sat in a part of the world that I'm used to reading about. it reminded me a bit of like Istanbul, Constantinople.
Yep.
Is that where it's supposed to be set, kind of?
Yeah, 100%. So again, if you would, so I've called it the city Arianople. So I wanted to change it slightly, but it's basically roughly 18th century Constantinople, as was then, or Istanbul now. I even went to Istanbul a few years ago and made sure that I hit up some of the sites that I had included and wanted to include in the future of the book. For me, part of the reason of doing that was, like I mentioned, I'm half British and then half Turkish Cypriot. So I kind of wanted to create this culture that was like I am, a combination of the two. I found it really interesting, like when I was at university studying, I did English and creative writing, and in studying English we talked a lot about Orientalism and this idea that Western Europe, and especially I'd say Britain, looked to the east as this like exotic, the jewel of the Orient and all of that kind of idea, and you would see Middle Eastern influences, especially like Turkish ones in the 18th century, for example, and Persian and stuff like that. And then especially I think more so going into the 19th century, you would see going out to India and then the Far East and China and so on, and all of those influences being the new big fashionable fad in Britain and Western Europe. In case you can't tell, I find history really interesting. It's like one of my biggest influences and inspirations, but I always kind of look at history and then go, okay, but what if this instead? So the idea with Arianople and its country Thanatolia was that, okay, well, what if that was the opposite way round? What if Orientalism was the opposite? So rather than a bunch of white people in Britain going, oh, fashionable, exotic East, we've got people in Arianople who are from Africa, Asia, the Middle East. If they're looking to the West as the fashionable place that they're taking inspiration from. And so it's like, oh, this is the latest thing out of London or Paris or whatever. And that's the new fad. So that was kind of my idea. And they view that as exotic.
Yeah, because that was what I found really interesting. When we were doing the first episode of this season on skin color, I was just sort of randomly going through like all the books on my Kindle, seeing how the authors I have on there, what they did around skin color, like how did they write skin. And that's when I noticed that in your first book, the only skin you describe is that of a white woman. That just blew my brain, because I thought that was, I'm assuming you did that on purpose.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, in that story, there's Derry, who is the one and only white character there. Everyone else is basically, like I said, a mix of Middle Eastern, African, Asian, and those kind of descended from those and mixes of those. To me, it just seems so, well, I know obviously one of the problems that you often get in fiction that's written by white people, as a lot of it that gets published tends to be, is that I can't help but kind of dip into kind of my literature, academia kind of background, but it's always the other that is described. Because, you know, white people go, oh, well, that white person, they just look like me. Whereas then they spend half a page describing the colour of this person's skin when it's a person of colour. And you're like, you know,
yeah,
way to make that person seem even more of an other. So I just, you know, like I said, when I had this idea of, okay, well, what if this story is here and it's looking to the West as exotic, that's what's going to be the other and what's going to look different and what's going to stand out. Whereas to the characters from Arianople, people of colour is the norm. These pale people, that's interesting. That's the thing that will stand out. And like I said, I wanted to do that because I wondered and I hoped, if I didn't want to go obviously too crazy because I wanted to be decent writing, but I was hoping maybe white people might read it and think, oh, this is weird, like I feel odd, and I don't know, maybe even give them an experience of othering which maybe they've never had before.
Yeah, what I found also interesting is that there is a class difference. So Derry she was freed or bought, I think, there was a money exchange, I think, right?
Fake money, as it turned out. So yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. So she was freed by the main character.
Mhm.
Just so the listeners can know, which book series are we talking about right now again?
So this is where I'm being overcomplicated, because I've actually taken those books down and I'm going to be re-releasing them over like the next year. So there used to be A Thief and a Gentleman was book 1, and book 2 was A Sleuth and a Charlatan, and that series was called Counterfeit Contessa. They're both, like I say, I've taken them both down. They are going to be coming back out as The Prince and the Thief, and I haven't revealed the name for book 2 yet, but yeah, so that'll be the series name. And there's a prequel came out November last year.
Okay, we'll put all the links in the show notes, but I know some people would want to go look this up.
And I know that this is the complicated bit, because I know you are rewriting or working on these books and going to release them, but I still wanted to talk about them. For me, it was very exciting. The woman of color protagonist we usually see as the exotic other is the one who frees this very pale-skinned slave.
Exactly. So I think like one of the things, I said about I took out that idea of empire and some of the things around that. So in my world, there is slavery, but it's much more based upon people being like the spoils of war and things like that. So the people who are enslaved in this world are from all over. And yeah, it's, I suppose in a way it's trying to counteract that white savior kind of narrative as well.
Yeah. So it's all reversed, basically.
Yeah, basically, in a lot of ways. I've just gone, well, this is a bit of a cliche that you see a lot that could be kind of problematic. I wonder if people will see it differently if they see a narrative where it's played out in the opposite way.
Yeah, well, I noticed that, but I don't know if other people, did anybody else ever mention anything?
I think I've had people kind of comment on it being unusual that it's a fantasy book that is, well, a lot of people comment on the fact it's a fantasy book in a different setting from usual, because it's not medieval Europe. And I have had people sort of comment and say, oh, actually, now I think of it, yeah, all of these characters are people of colour except for one. That is unusual. So I think kind of people have picked up on bits and pieces.
That was really exciting for me. Your other series,
mm-hmm.
I don't even know the name. I know the titles, but what is the name of the full series?
So that one is just named after the first book. So that's Beneath Black Sails.
Okay, that makes it easy.
Yeah, that's why I did that.
So that is set in the same universe.
Mm-hmm.
That is actually from the Albion. Is it you call it Albion?
Yes, yeah. So the main character in that is from the equivalent of Britain, which is called Albion. But most of the action takes place in the Caribbean, because as the Black Sails bit of the name might suggest, it's a pirate book. And of course, you've got to have pirate book in the Caribbean, right?
Yes, basically.
Yeah. It's the law.
So, Claire, are there any stereotypes or tropes around any of your own identities or experiences that you find annoying or perhaps even harmful?
As I mentioned, sort of some of my identities, I've always people tend to look at me and think, oh, she's white, but she's foreign white. Like I often get looked at, like people often ask me where I'm from. I've been asked if I speak English, things like that. The kind of the ones that stand out for me the most are, so like I mentioned, half my family are Muslim. And obviously that was an interesting thing to experience around like the London bombings and 9/11 and things like that. I remember obviously when there were a lot of people that would essentially eye up brown-skinned men with beards, which is what my father is, with suspicion. Like, I literally was saying to him, don't go on the London Underground with a rucksack on and things like that, because especially after a man was basically shot by the London police for looking dodgy at some point after the London bombings. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but he got shot dead. And it's like, that was very much, that really affected me and sort of stood out in my mind, and it gave me a lot of concerns for my father and for other members of my family who look like that. Sorry, what did you say, Bethany?
I was like, that's a fear that's difficult to live with, and you have to just keep going, but you're still thinking about it all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So it was that, and also when I was probably a bit younger than that, say when I was like 16, 17, 18, I can remember on a number of occasions going somewhere with my dad, and there was this weird thing would happen. People would look at me and assume I was his wife. It was like this really horrible, icky assumption about Middle Eastern men, and then that their wives are childlike or very young, like submissive, powerless women. And like people would say, oh, is your wife, blah, blah, blah. It's like, this is my daughter, like what? So that made me go, oh, okay. People, because like I said, when people see me, I think they generally see a foreign white woman. Like people maybe think I'm Eastern European or Spanish or Italian, or something like that, maybe Middle Eastern. But that really showed me, it's like, oh, okay, so that's what people see when they see a Middle Eastern man and a Middle Eastern woman. And that was like, okay, it's an interesting one.
That is, I'm sort of trying to close my jaw here.
Yeah, and literally I was like 15 and 16 when this would happen, and obviously my father's like 28 years older than me, something like that, about 30 years older than me. And yeah, people on more than one occasion thought that I was his wife, or me, and hell, they probably even thought I was one of his wives. Frankly, like that was the way they were treating us.
Did that in any way help you decide to set yours? I forget how it's going to be called.
The reverse othering that appears in your work, perhaps.
Yeah.
From a young age, I was very much aware that although I look quite white, I also look different. And like when I would go and visit my grandmother, like on my father's side, I didn't call her grandmother or grandma or whatever. I called her nene. That's Turkish for grandmother. And we would do things around Eid or whatever, and we would have Turkish food and all of these things. And she doesn't write English very well, and I've got family that I can't speak to directly because they only speak Turkish and I don't speak Turkish. So all of those things have informed all of my life growing up and things like that. And so I think that it's made me much more aware of othering and diversity than maybe my friends whose families are all Western European, say. So I think it's always just made me very conscious of those things, which then, like you said, Bethany, has made me, when I've then come to write, I haven't just gone, right, so obviously everyone is white and cisgender and like middle class or whatever and heterosexual. Actually, there's a much bigger palette in the world at play that I can work with and include in my fictional writing, because frankly that's the way the world is.
It really is. The world is way more diverse than you would think on this, than we've written into our literary English lexicon.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yes, the canon is so limited, but I think that is one of the reasons why we're doing this podcast, is because we want to encourage people to look further. The thing is, I do think that we tend to, at least when we start writing, I think we might tell stories that are familiar to us, whether that's our own story or whether that's sort of like stories that we've read. And if the canon is this limited, then we're going to reproduce certain stories, certain plot lines, certain tropes. And I think we need to challenge that.
So
exactly, yeah.
So were there any other stereotypes beyond your own identities that you find harmful or annoying that, you try to work with as an author, or that you're just conscious of as a reader?
When I was writing what is going to become The Prince and the Thief, when I was first writing that, I actually deliberately, when I would get to, like if you have a side character has to come on to do whatever, like whether it's the person letting that person into something, or that's working at a shop or something, or is maybe a judge or something like that, unless there was a specific reason for them to be a specific gender, I was literally flipping a coin to decide whether they were presented as a guy or a girl.
I love that.
Because it was like, well, hang on a minute. I suppose I sort of was starting to notice some of my own unconscious biases coming out, where I'd be like, oh yeah, well this is going to be a woman working in this kind of shop because it's this kind of. So hang on a second, is there any reason for that to be a woman? Probably not. So flip a coin. I didn't want it to be, I suppose, gendered roles, and I didn't want it to be, oh, well, I've just fallen onto the quote, like default of it being a guy. So I literally was flipping a coin to decide whether that person, like say, outward presentation, because that's what the narrator's seeing, whether they're a guy or a woman.
I think flipping the coin is a really good strategy for making these kind of decisions.
And I mean, this was, oh my God, I started writing that book in 2009. So I probably haven't even heard of like non-binary, to be honest, or like gender fluidity or anything. Whereas I think if I was doing the same thing now, I'd maybe have a dice and use more than just a binary in making that decision. But I've tried to kind of internalize that anyway and just be like, oh, hold on, this person is stepping forward. They can be a they, not a he or a she. Let's do that. So that there's that coming through in the Leaf Back Sales series, for example. And I've been doing that in the book I've been writing currently.
I'm going to use that too, because I also always want to flip the script, basically. But sometimes I wonder where, because I don't really want to flip the script, because that's sort of, then we get stuck in the same binary, it's just, the other way around. So how do you create a balance where everyone can just do whatever they want to do, and it doesn't really matter anymore which gender is doing what, like everybody can do whatever. So now I try to come up with reasons why a certain person likes to be in the kitchen and why another person likes to be in charge of the finances of the house, for example, if it's a couple.
Yeah, exactly.
So
it's like, oh, was actually her father was an accountant, so she deals with the family's finances or whatever.
Yes, instead of just going like all the men are in the kitchen, because that was when I first started drafting my fantasy novel. I was more like, I'm just turning it completely upside down, and I thought that also doesn't work.
Yeah,
because there are women who like to cook. But I like flip the coin. I probably will be using that, and maybe I'll go for the dice as well.
I don't know. This sounds like an excellent excuse to go buy some really pretty Dungeons and Dragon dice at Match.
I was going to say, I do play D&D, so I do have a plethora of dice with many faces that are quite pretty, so it's quite a handy way to use them.
That's exactly what I was picturing. Like the more faces, the better, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
D20, right? Go for it.
Have you reached that sweet place where you've written out your entire story? It's a wonderful feeling. You've worked so hard for this, spent so many long hours at the keyboard or talking to yourself via recorder, then going over it again at the computer. It's been mostly internal work, and it's often been alone. But now, it's time to take it from rough to polished, and for that, outside perspective is essential. Let me help you. As a developmental editor, I, Bethany A. Tucker, will take your hand, sort through your draft, answer your questions, and help you polish it until your work shines. You don't have to do this alone. It doesn't matter if this is your first book or your 10th book, whether you've published this book already and want to make it better, or you're teetering on the edge, eager to publish for the first time. Together, we can take your book to the next level. Contact me via links in the show notes or at theartandscienceofwords@gmail.com to take the next step.
So I want to ask you, would you mind sharing some of the challenges that have come up for you in terms of plot or characters while writing these particular stories? And of course, we would very much like to know what helped you overcome these challenges.
I mentioned earlier that, oh, you're writing a pirate story, of course it's got to be in the Caribbean. But obviously that's problematic in itself. I mean, for one thing, there have been pirates in the Mediterranean. There's a very famous female pirate who I think was Chinese. Off the top of my head, I can't remember her name now, but there have been pirates all over the world. Caribbean is obviously the kind of, I suppose, archetypal thing that comes to mind to me as a British person, but didn't want to perpetuate like colonial narratives in writing that. And I kind of, to be honest, that only struck me once I'd already started writing it. And so I went, I hadn't really thought about this. And for me, I suppose because of all the things I've already spoken about, like the fact that I try to be very conscious of, and just naturally, I suppose, I'm conscious that there is more than just the white British, and with that obviously comes colonial narrative and all of that stuff. I always try to be very conscious of that, and where I come from as a person makes me hopefully more conscious of that. So as soon as I'm aware of something like that, I need to act upon it. I can't my integrity is very important to me. So I sort of went, right, I need to make sure I'm not doing that. Some of the things that I'd already done in my world helped me with that. So like I was saying, with the fact that empire didn't play out in the world as it did in our world. Same thing with slavery. That's not the same like transatlantic slave trade that we have in our world. So obviously my Caribbean was already very different. So once I realized that this can potentially be an issue, that I didn't want to add to the suffering that had already happened in the real world. Like I didn't want to perpetuate that in a book or sweep it under the rug and thus like minimize it. I kind of took a step back and thought, okay, how could things have potentially played out differently? Obviously, sort of Portugal and Spain, what they did in like Central and South America, and what Britain and settlers from here did in North America, especially, as well as like France and so on, did the same, was like a horrific massacre. Absolutely don't deny that. And that's why I really wanted to do something different in this. So like I said, I thought, okay, well, how could history have played out differently? And it's that question that's at the center of fiction writing, right? Is what if that is the center of fiction? So yeah, I kind of played with that idea, and I looked at, again, like, because I'm very inspired by history, if anybody, if you're familiar with like Clifton or Gallup's strengths, my number one strength is context, which tends to take information from the past, for example, to help build up a picture of now and the future in very simple terms. So dipping into real life history and so on helped me kind of come up with the idea of, okay, so this, when I say it out loud, almost sounds a bit ridiculous, but China actually had a variolation for smallpox, like way, I forget off the top of my head now how far in history, but they had that a really long time ago, and I think they're meant to have invented it. So I thought, well, okay, in that case, what if China was the first contact between the old world and Americas, and therefore everyone wasn't just wiped out by smallpox? And I kind of just played it of, okay, so what if this initial contact came from a different way, and what if they had firearms because of that, because obviously China and gunpowder and so on. And that just kind of let me look at history in a different way and kind of paint it in a different way that meant that the indigenous people of North, Central and South America weren't essentially horrific victims in history. What if actually they found a way that they could survive and thrive, and that therefore their cultures and way of life and so on was still a thriving real thing that was widespread and not limited to pockets? And that was kind of what I tried to create. And their contact with Europe was on a much more even footing based upon trade rather than the horrors of empire and slavery, if that makes any sense at all. And it's a very long and rambling answer.
No, it does. I love it. I studied East Asian studies in uni. So like China did have this amazing navy and was trading, seafaring with the edge of Africa, as you might know. And it wasn't until this one king emperor got really, really uppity and decided he was the center of the universe and that everyone had to come to him. And then they kind of got rid of their navy at one point. So if that hadn't happened, China very well could have like colonized California, which most people don't realize Russia actually started to do at one point.
That's it. And I didn't know that but that makes a lot of sense. So thank you for that. It's really interesting. You probably set off some more ideas in my head, but
there's an actual fort that you can go to that the Russians like build a trading post and a fort and everything on the coast. I think it's called Fort Ross now. And I went there as a child and I was like, oh my gosh, the Russians were here, like really here.
When was that?
Early days. I mean,
how early is that?
I'm trying to remember. I think they may have clashed with the conquistadors, but I'm not exactly sure. I went and visited the fort when I was 7, and it never showed up in my history book. So if I hadn't actually been there, I wouldn't have known about it.
Oh, that is really interesting. Oh, thank you. I'm going to look that up.
To me, that actually makes a lot of sense that it didn't show up in history books, because, there's a very particular history that we're being taught.
Yeah, because, as we know, America was, I'm doing air quotes here, you can't see, discovered by Europeans, because before then it didn't exist. That
Yes.
is me speaking my fluent sarcasm.
Yeah.
So as you can probably tell by the tone of my sarcasm, that's the sort of thing that annoys me.
Yeah. Well, but that's
We should probably do an episode on the history you don't know that would make your fantasy more interesting.
Claire, what I find it, because I know your books, I've read them all, is that so much of that world building it's not in your books. Like, I had no idea that this was behind your reasonings. So I find that extremely interesting. Your world works. Like, there's nowhere in your world that I'm like, no, this doesn't make sense. So I guess that comes because you really thought it out.
Very broadly, I think of kind of like classic fantasy and a more, I suppose, modern breed of fantasy, if you like. And to me, the classic fantasy is that super Tolkien-esque, like super detailed world building, and a lot of that world building is on the page. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not to my taste. You know, I read that back when I was much younger, but it's not something that I can read now, and it's not something I want to write. I tend to write things that are, like I say, I consider more modern fantasy to wear its world building quite lightly. And I suppose I try and think of it like that cliched image of an iceberg, where I maybe know all of this stuff, but you only see that thing at the tip. Because frankly, we're here to read about the fantasy adventure, and in my case, like people getting together and all of that good stuff, and the banter and the fun. You know, you're probably not here to read about what happened 200, 300 years ago in my world. But yeah, I tried to show it in things like, I'll mention that my equivalent of Europe was invited across to trade, whereas before trade had all, I think I mentioned that trade had all gone through Asia from the Americas. But yeah, it's like, that's one sentence in a series that is going to, like when I finish this last book, is going to be 4 novels plus a short novel. So it's probably getting on for like 500,000 words. There's one sentence in that.
Yeah. But I think that goes to show that you do need to know the whole iceberg when you write something like this to make it come across in the right way.
Although what I would say, because I spent a very long time writing my writing life, not finishing books and not getting very far in books. And one of the very many ways I managed to do that was thinking I needed to know everything about my entire fantasy world before I could start writing the story. You need to know how your iceberg works and how it floats and the bit that's below the surface, but you don't need to know it all before you start writing. There's definitely something, like a lot of things that I've put in my world have developed as I've been writing, and I've gone, oh, well, I wonder what would be behind this, or why this would be like that, or oh, how does this work in this part of the world, and things like that. And I've worked it out as I've gone.
Yeah, like it shouldn't become another obstacle.
Yeah, exactly. Like we have enough obstacles to writing. Like I first sat down to write my very first novel. I was like, I'm going to write a novel, and I was like 11 or 12 years old, and I didn't finish one until I was in my 30s. I know there are enough obstacles. Do not make your world building one of them.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. But I do think, like you said, like you need to know how it works, but you also need to have that self-awareness to know that you're still figuring things out for the right reason and not for the wrong reason. Which is, you know, as an excuse to not finish the damn thing.
Yeah, or to not start it sometimes.
Or that.
So you've talked about world building, knowing the iceberg. You've talked about where some of your ideas come from. As you're going through your work, when you're giving it that more editorial eye, which I know you said before we got on the call that you often edit while you're writing, how do you calibrate your perspective and check your blind spots?
I would say this is something that I could do better. I was going to say that from the start on that. I do work with beta readers. To be honest, they're kind of randomly chosen from, well, not randomly, but they are chosen from people who happen to be big fans of mine. But I don't currently work with sensitivity readers, but that is something that I'm considering and looking at depending on what is coming through in particular books I'm working on. I do also dip into, I've got a couple of resources that I find really helpful. One is the Decolonial Atlas, and the other one is, it's actually a Tumblr, and I'm not like a big Tumblr generation kind of person, but writing with colour on Tumblr is incredible.
Yeah, we've referred to that resource quite a few times.
I just thought so. Yeah, I was like, they're
Yeah.
gonna know that. It's amazing. When you were saying earlier about Mariëlle, about me describing Derry's skin tone and then other people's skin tones and things like that, like they have certain of their articles on there are just so invaluable. So I try and, like I say, read up on things like that and just engage in conversation online, or even just sit back and read the conversations that other people are having online and go, and as I'm reading them, I'm going, am I doing this? Am I inadvertently doing this? And if particular concerns come to mind, I try and raise those with like trusted people I can speak to. And like I said, particularly like with this colonial aspect, for example, in the pirate series, it's something I've gone through and discussed with people quite a bit. But I would say that, yeah, I probably can do that better, and I would like to try and involve people more in that, I suppose.
Sounds like you're definitely not working in a vacuum, and you've also worked within the realm of your own experience and your family's experiences as well.
I've considered myself very lucky that I've had that experience, because it allows me, like, white heterosexual Christian is not my default and never has been. So whereas I think for a lot of people it is, and they never realise that that's their default, because it's never highlighted as there ever really being anything else that could be their default, or that they have to switch off of the default. So yeah, I consider myself really lucky to have that lens that I see the world through. So hopefully that keeps me away. And like I said, I did when I was at university, obviously you study, the literary canon is a thing, but but did you notice that it's all white guys? Yes, I did notice that. So we did work about gendered language and post-colonialism and all that sort of thing. And like my BA dissertation, thinking back now because it's quite a while ago, but I looked at eco-critical theory, for example, and feminism in my dissertation. So that made me very aware of power structures back in my 20s, and kind of the way that they rely upon binaries and othering and denigrating the binary they want to keep out of power and things like that. So I think I suppose if I were to try and phrase that in a way that could be helpful to people, it is maybe to research and be curious about the world and learn about these things. So and the things that you learn about will start changing your lens.
What comes out of the end of your pencil or on your keyboard, to be honest.
Exactly. It's like those things that come out have to come out of something going in. It has to be an input for there to be an output. And if your life and input has always been white heterosexual Christian middle class, blah blah blah, unsurprisingly that's what's going to come out of, like you say, your pen or your keyboard.
Could you name one or two authors who you think do diversity well in their writing?
Yeah, so a couple for me would be Anne Leckie's Imperial, I'm never quite sure how to say it, Radch, Radch is the name of the trilogy. So Imperial Radch. It starts with a book called Ancillary Justice. So I don't often read sci-fi, but this one I found really fascinating, because she's writing about, and I read this several years ago now, so I'm hazy on some of the details, but this really stands out to me still all these years later, and I always forget stuff in books. She's writing about a kind of essentially an empire where there is no gender. Everyone is she. Everyone is referred to as she. And it really massively plays with your perception and your assumptions when you're reading, because it is never indicated to you that this person is male, female, cisgender, whatever. Like it literally, people just referred to as she, all of them. And that really
so she becomes like human.
Sorry?
Like we often think, like when we look at language, like you can refer to he, right? Right? It's like, man refers to all of humankind. So this is turned around. Everybody is a she.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's nothing else. Yeah, that's quite 100%. Interesting. Yeah.
And and you had things like people having relationships in that, and you kind of went, oh, I found myself, for some reason, I had always pictured this person in a more feminine way. So, and it's just, because of the way it's written, you really start becoming conscious about how you perceive gender and your assumptions around. Yeah, I just found that really fascinating flip of, like you say, that idea. It's like, oh, can mean her as, no, it can't. Use they. Sorry, that really irritates me.
Yeah.
So that's, and like I say, and lackey. It begins with the book Ancillary Justice. There's a book I've actually just picked up. I don't generally read YA anymore, but this one I couldn't resist. It's by, like I said, I've only just picked it up, so I've not started it yet, but the concept is amazing. So it's Kaylin Bayron, and the book is called Cinderella Is Dead. It's, like I say, YA. It's fantasy, but there's kind of a dystopian element to society. It's set 200 years after Cinderella, and like that was all kind of real, essentially. And it's kind of a queer reimagining. The main characters are both, I think, people of colour, and the author is a person of colour as well. So I've just picked up, I haven't started yet, but that concept, I was like, oh, like Cinderella Is Dead, first of all, stands out. And then, yeah, the fact that it's a queer person of colour reimagining, I'm really intrigued to get started on that one.
Yeah. It's a very provocative title. It would definitely get my attention.
Right, yeah, you couldn't walk, and also the cover is gorgeous. Like, you couldn't walk past that title. You can scroll past that title, and you can't walk past that cover. It's like, oh, what is this about? So that's why, even though I don't read, why I had to stop and have a closer look, kind of thing.
I do think, I know some people who do like the fairy tale retellings. And this is the great fun about reading. Some are they're really taking it out of context and turning it all upside down. And that is really, like, there's so much to play with and so much to kick against.
Exactly.
In a sense, yeah.
Yeah, she's really like taken it another level removed. So I'm excited to dip into that one once I've finished my current project and have a bit of time to read. The other author I wanted to mention is Jessica M. Butler, who, full disclosure, is a friend of mine also, but she also writes epic fantasy books that have romance in. She's an Indigenous author, she's from North America. Her world building and so on, and her approach to really having a white European characters and culture and so on, she really, I would say, dips into that way more. Well, not dips in, I dip into it. She dives in. So she's definitely one to look out for, and she has a number of has some standalones and has the Two Ra Chronicles. My mind's gone blank on the name now, but Jessica M. Butler, she recently changed from J.M. Butler. She is a diverse author and also writes about diversity. And the other one is May Sage, who is, I read her fantasy, which has romance in again, because everything I read does. And she actually doesn't always she often writes white characters, but I think it's really important to support authors of colour, or support people of colour, because if we say that, actually, if you're an author of colour, you need to write characters of colour, well, a lot of studies appear to have shown that those books make less money. So you're automatically saying, well, you're going to make less money. Whereas white people going around writing about white characters sell more, are more likely to sell more books when they put white characters on the cover, for example. So I think even if an author of colour is writing, or a diverse author is writing non-diverse characters, I think that's still a good reason to go and pick their books up.
Yeah, I'm definitely gonna find the links to all their work and just put them in the show notes for everyone to have a look at. That's great. I'm really intrigued by some of these.
Yeah, they're pretty much all new titles to me, so that's exciting.
It's like every time we have an interview, our TBR list is just exploding.
Yes. I know, it's don't go on.
That's a dangerous question.
Book talk, or read any articles about books. Just
my
pile.
My to be read list is extremely long at this point, and it's funny because doing this podcast and working on my own books, I have less time to read than before.
Yeah.
So we have one last question here, and then I'm looking at the clock, and we should probably wrap up.
Yes.
What would be your advice to anyone wanting to write more diverse characters in their work?
Cool. So I'm not just going to say read history because I did. No.
I mean, I do say that to people,
but it's not a bad idea.
That is true. I do, but I am aware that not everyone is as into history as my context number one strength loving self is. But I think the most important thing to bear in mind, I suppose this, at risk of repeating myself, goes back to what I was saying about my personal lens not having a default, I suppose, of white male, blah, blah, blah. Diverse characters are just like any other character.
They're human.
Exactly. Like I was saying earlier, when I flip a coin, like, why not a woman in that role? Why not have someone who's non-binary serves at the bar that your character goes up to? Why not a person of colour who is the judge in the big courtroom scene? Like, why not? Obviously, sometimes there may be a very good reason in your world, whether it's the real world or a fantasy world, for you not to have that. But if there isn't, why not? Why not have that? I think especially, I know it can be very intimidating, and certain quarters like Twitter and so on are frankly scary places sometimes. You know, you think, whoa, this person's getting slammed because they wrote a character of colour and got something wrong, or they wrote a gay person and got that wrong. I better never do that because otherwise I'm going to get slammed too. So I understand, like, you know, and don't make one, you know, a character whose experience is different from yours your main character without doing the work for it. But these characters, you know, that populate your world, it doesn't have to be the main character who has this diverse feature or this diverse aspect to them, or this feature that's different from you. It can be everyone. It can be everyone else. It can be all these other different people. And again, it doesn't have to necessarily be a big deal, but you might start noticing that actually you keep having, you know, when you start writing that bar scene, actually, yeah, I've made it a white guy behind the bar. And oh my God, like 3 scenes later when they're at the courtroom, it's a white guy who's the judge. Why have I done that? Oh, hold on. Is it because that is my default? So I think those characters should be everywhere. So just start being aware that, are you constantly doing a character like you, or that's like the default? Personally, I know that not everyone may agree with this, but to me, if someone gets it wrong, I know intention is not magical, I know that, but if someone gets it wrong, I think, and they are trying to do the right thing, but they got it wrong and they made a mistake, we should be approaching that. And I try to approach it from, like, to me, the best outcome of that is that person grows and they learn, and then in future they get it right.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, not everyone approaches it like that. And I accept that I have the privilege of being a nowadays middle class cis woman who presents white. Like, I get that. I know I've not had to do the emotional baggage and labour that a lot of other people have had to do. So it's easy for me to say that. So I know that's not necessarily a comfort to people, but there are other people who think this way. And I think if you're going to do this, you have to accept that you'll get something wrong. But the best way to combat that is to educate yourself and just keep learning and keep trying to do better and listen more than you speak and all those sorts of things, so that even if you do, when you inevitably get something wrong, you can hopefully do better next time.
Yeah. Just keep.
Yeah. It reminds me of our calm the fuck down checklist.
Yeah, that's the checklist from season 1 about what happens if you get called out. We literally made a checklist for everyone and put it on a website as an extra for that episode.
Yeah, like first thing you do is breathe. Like first thing is always breathe, and then, you know, and also we try to approach it as well as like sort of an affirmative reading. And I think somewhere in the checklist we say, if it is really bad, you have the power to change it.
I do think that we haven't mentioned, but I'm an indie author. If I were to find, if I find something that's horrific that I hadn't realised I'd done, I can like pull my book down, I can change things, I can fix it, like you said. Obviously, that isn't always the case for traditionally published authors.
No.
But yeah, we have that. The beauty of indie is that we can do that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That was Great.
Yeah, thank you
Oh,
for
thank
coming
you.
on and sharing all this. I wish this was a travel podcast because I would so ask you questions about visiting Istanbul and your research there. But unfortunately, I can't do that today. But maybe we'll meet up at a writing conference someday and I can ask you all my questions.
I will bore you with my photos, definitely.
Oh, then I will bring all of my photos of China because, oh my gosh, travel is amazing.
Amazing. I miss it.
Yes, same. All right. Thank you so much for all of this information and for your unique perspective, because you really did bring a unique perspective where you're straddling the line of both sides of many of these questions. I'm excited to share this with our audience.
Yes, and I'm going to put everything in the show notes, including where listeners can find Clare, but also where people can find Clare's services. So everything will be in the show notes for those who want to get in touch.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me on and creating this lovely safe space to discuss these things.
Thank you for joining us. Music for this show was written and produced by Eric Mills. If you found this episode helpful, please rate and review on your favorite podcast app and spread the word so other writers can find us too. To get our Doing Diversity in Writing Toolkit, which includes all bonus material from Season 1, go to representationmatters.art. That's .art. Here you will also find our episode show notes. Happy writing and see you next episode!